Thabo Mbeki is a South African politician who served as the second president of South Africa from June 14, 1999 to September 24, 2008, when he resigned at the request of his party, the African National Congress, ANC. Before that, he was deputy president under Nelson Mandela from 1994 to 1999. The son of Govan Mbeki, a renowned ANC intellectual, Mbeki has been involved in ANC politics since 1956, when he joined the ANC Youth League, and has been a member of the party's National Executive Committee since 1975. Born in the Transkei, he left South Africa aged 20 to attend university in England, and spent almost 3 decades in exile abroad, until the ANC was unbanned in 1990. He rose through the organization in its information and publicity section and as Oliver Tambo's protege, but he was also an experienced diplomat, serving as the ANC's official representative in several of its African outposts. He was an early advocate for and leader of the diplomatic engagements which led to the negotiations to end apartheid. After South Africa's first democratic elections in 1994, he was appointed National Deputy President. In subsequent years, it became apparent that he was Mandela's chosen successor, and he was elected unopposed as ANC president in 1997, enabling his rise to the presidency as the ANC's candidate in the 1999 elections. While deputy president, Mbeki had been regarded as a steward of the government's growth, employment and redistribution policy, introduced in 1996, and as president he continued to subscribe to relatively conservative, market-friendly macroeconomic policies. During his presidency, South Africa experienced falling public debt, a narrowing budget deficit, and consistent, moderate economic growth. However, despite his retention of various social democratic programs, and notable expansions to the Black Economic Empowerment Program, critics often regarded Mbeki's economic policies as neoliberal, with insufficient consideration for developmental and redistributive objectives. On these grounds, Mbeki grew increasingly alienated from the left wing of the ANC, and from the leaders of the ANC's tripartite alliance partners, the Congress of South African Trade Unions and South African Communist Party. It was these leftist elements which supported Jacob Zuma over Mbeki in the political rivalry that erupted after Mbeki removed the latter from his post as deputy president in 2005. As president, Mbeki had an apparent predilection for foreign policy and particularly for multilateralism. His Pan-Africanism and vision for an African Renaissance are central parts of his political persona, and commentators suggest that he secured for South Africa a role in African and global politics that was disproportionate to the country's size and historical influence. He was the central architect of the new Partnership for Africa's Development and, as the inaugural chairperson of the African Union, spearheaded the introduction of the African Peer Review Mechanism. After the IBSA Dialogue Forum was launched in 2003, his government collaborated with India and Brazil to lobby for reforms at the United Nations, advocating for a stronger role for developing countries. Among South Africa's various peacekeeping commitments during his presidency, Mbeki was the primary mediator in the conflict between ZANU-PF and the Zimbabwean opposition in the 2000s. However, he was frequently criticized for his policy of quiet diplomacy in Zimbabwe, under which he refused to condemn Robert Mugabe's regime or institute sanctions against it. Also highly controversial worldwide was Mbeki's HIV/AIDS policy. His government did not introduce a national mother-to-child transmission prevention program until 2002, when it was mandated by the Constitutional Court, nor did it make antiretroviral therapy available in the public health care system until late 2003. Subsequent studies have estimated that these delays caused hundreds of thousands of preventable deaths. Mbeki himself, like his health minister Mantoch Habalala, has been described as an AIDS denialist, dissident, or septic. Although he did not explicitly deny the causal link between HIV and AIDS, he often posited a need to investigate alternate causes of and alternative treatments for AIDS, frequently suggesting that immunodeficiency was the indirect result of poverty. His political descent began at the ANC's Polokwane conference in December 2007, when he was replaced as ANC president by Zuma. His term as national president was not due to expire until June 2009, but, on September 20, 2008, he announced that he would resign at the request of the ANC National Executive Committee. The ANC's decision to recall Mbeki was understood to be linked to a High Court judgment, handed down earlier that month, in which Judge Chris Nicholson had alleged improper political interference in the National Prosecuting Authority and specifically in the corruption charges against Zuma. Nicholson's judgment was overturned by the Supreme Court of Appeal in January 2009, by which time Mbeki had been replaced as president by Kgalema Motlanthe. Thabo Mbeki was born on June 18, 1942, in Bululani, meaning place of seed, a tiny village in Idutywa in Transkei, now Eastern Cape. His middle name Mbuyelwe is Kosa and means he for whom the people sing. Both his parents were teachers, activists, and members of the Communist Party of South Africa, CPSA later renamed the SACP. His father, Govan Mbeki, was a leading figure in the activities of the African National Congress, ANC, in the Eastern Cape. Thabo Mbeki was named after one of his father's best friends, Thabo Mafutsenyana, a leading member of the Communist Party at the time. Mbeki had an older sister, Linda, and two younger brothers, Molitsi and Jama. In 1954, it was decided that Mbeki should join Lovedale College in Alice. Lovedale was started by missionaries and many future leaders of South Africa, including Mbeki's father, had studied there. Known as the Eton of Africa, the school was the first South African high school to admit blacks for over a century. Founded in 1841 by the Scottish Presbyterian Church, it was built on land, granted to it by Kosa King Kika, and was situated in the fertile valley along the Tyam River in Alice. The school was the center of black intellectual activity during the first half of the 20th century. Its alumni include the likes of Oliver Tambo, Nelson Mandela, Robert Mugabe, and Chief Mangosuthu Buthelezi, among others. Mbeki was one of 52 boys and 42 girls that started Standard 6, Grade 8, in 1955. He was placed in Shaw House along with other Transkei border boys, who were stereotyped by the others as being mogos, slang for the boys from the country who were not as sophisticated as those from towns such as Port Elizabeth and East London. The city boys adopted jazzier fashions and attitudes, while the Transkei boys were more conservative. There was also a difference in the sports they chose, as the Transkei boys played soccer while the Eastern Cape boys all played rugby. Mbeki chose rugby, and despite the fact that he was not good at the game, he stuck with it throughout his time at Lovedale. In 1956, Mbeki joined the ANC Youth League after a brief period with the Trotskyist Unity Movement's Society of Young Africans, SOYA. Although only 14 years of age at the time, he became active in student politics. In 1960, the ANC was banned, making it difficult for members to operate openly. Not long after, Govan and Nelson Mandela became fugitives. In 1961, during his final year at high school, Mbeki was expelled for leading a class boycott against the expulsion of a fellow student. At this time, the ANC was for the first time considering violent revolution. Mbeki returned home to Mbuyulani, enrolled at a correspondence school and finished his schooling. He found being home frustrating as he wanted to study further and engage in politics. The ANC did not have a branch in Mbuyulani, and he wanted to be in Johannesburg. His parents agreed that he should travel to Johannesburg to further his studies. They contacted Duma Nakwi, a well-known Sowetan lawyer and important leader of the ANC in the area, to seek accommodation for their son. Nakwi agreed to have Mbeki live with his family. In 1961, Mbeki traveled to Soweto to start an exciting new life. He was amazed at the size of the big city and its vitality. He met Nelson Mandela and other leaders of the ANC and learned much about politics and law from the Nakwi family, and put much effort into his post-matric studies at Britius College in Johannesburg. It was not long before Mbeki was elected secretary of the African Students Association, ASA, while still being enrolled at Britius College, but the association collapsed after many of its members were arrested. At this time, political movements were folding under increasingly severe attacks from the state. Mbeki continued his studies by enrolling to study economics via correspondence with London University. After the banning of the ANC, the organization decided it would be better for the Mbeki to go into exile. In 1962, Mbeki and a group of comrades left South Africa disguised as a football team. They traveled in a minibus to Botswana and flew from there to Tanzania, where Mbeki accompanied Kenneth Kaunda, who later became Zambia's post-independence president, to London. Mbeki stayed with Oliver Tambo, who became the effective leader of the ANC after Mandela was imprisoned. Mbeki worked part-time with Tambo and Yusuf Dadoo while studying economics at Sussex University in the coastal town of Brighton. At one stage, Mbeki shared a flat with two other students, Mike Yates and Derek Gunby. Together the trio would become firm friends and frequent a local bar when they were not discussing politics and listening to music. It was here that Mbeki developed a deep love for Brecht and Shakespeare and an appreciation of Yeats. He also came to love the blues. In February 1963, 3 months after his arrival at the university, Mbeki was elected onto the Student Union Committee. By April, he was one of 28 signatories petitioning in support of Spies for Peace, a document that revealed secret information about Britain's plans for civil defense and government in the event of a nuclear attack. On July 11, 1963, the high command of the ANC was caught at Lily's Leaf Farm in Rivonia, one of them being Govan Mbeki. In order to hold the prisoners, the General Laws Amendment Act, No. 37 of 1963, was rushed through Parliament and applied retroactively to June 27, 1962, mainly but not exclusively so that the people arrested at Rivonia could be detained and held in solitary confinement. In July of the same year, Mbeki began mobilizing international support against apartheid. Horrified at the act, Mbeki led a successful motion in the student union to condemn the move and join the boycott of South African goods. He strongly condemned the South African government's new restrictions on political activity and likened it to in the politics of Nazi Germany. In April 1964, Mbeki appeared before a delegation of the United Nations, UN, Special Committee Against Apartheid to plead for the life of his father, who by then had been charged with planning an armed uprising against the state. The death penalty seemed a certainty for all the Rivonia treason trialists. This was the first time Mbeki had spoken about his father from the perspective of a son, but the biological category was converted into a political context. If the butchers have their way, we will draw strength even from the little crosses that the kind may put at the head of their graves. In that process we shall learn. We shall learn to hate evil even more, and in the same intensity we shall seek to destroy it. We shall learn to be brave and unconscious of anything but this noblest of struggles. Today we might be but weak children, spurred on by nothing other than the fear and grief of losing our fathers. In time we shall learn to die both for ourselves and for the millions. The dream deferred. On October 6, the Rivonia trialists were formally charged. On June 13, 1964, Mbeki organized a march from Brighton to London, after the Rivonia trialists were found guilty of high treason. They were expected to be sentenced to death. The students held a night march to 10 Downing Street and handed a petition, signed by 664 staff and students at Sussex University, to the Prime Minister. Thereafter, they held a demonstration outside South Africa House in Trafalgar Square. The next day, London television showed Mbeki leading the march. This kind of lobbying helped the trialists, who were spared the hangman's noose. For the next 3 decades, Mbeki would take up the job of rallying support against apartheid. Mbeki completed his bachelor's degree in economics at Sussex University in May 1965. With his own parents unable to attend his graduation ceremony, Adelaide Tambo and Michael Harmel took their place at the event. While in London, Mbeki spent all of his summers with the Thabo family. After completing his first degree, Mbeki planned to join Umkhonto we Sizwe, MK, and he sought permission to do so, but this plan was vetoed by Thabo, who advised him to do a master's degree. In October 1965, Mbeki returned to Sussex for 1 year to do his master's in economics and development. Mbeki at this time shared a flat with Peter Lawrence and Ingram, situated at 3 Silwood Street. While in England, Mbeki supported the Labour Party, then led by Harold Wilson. Mbeki was intensely critical of the New Left revision of Marxism that swept Europe in the latter half of the 1960s and remained ardently loyal to the Soviet Union, which at the time heavily sponsored the ANC's underground movement, providing them with financial and educational support, as well as arms and military training. On May 18, 1966, Mbeki organized a 24-hour vigil at the Clock Tower in Brighton Central Square against Ian Smith's unilateral declaration of independence in Rhodesia. In October 1966, Mbeki moved to London to work for the ANC full-time. During this period he met his wife-to-be, Zanele Dlamini, a social worker from Alexandra Township in Johannesburg, who was also studying in London. Zanele had just moved to London at this time. In 1966, Mbeki appealed to Oliver Tambo to allow any South African student who supported the ANC to be admitted into the movement's Youth and Students Section, YSS, irrespective of race. Tambo agreed and the YSS became the first non-racial arm of the ANC. In the same year, the ANC upheld its decision to exclude non-Africans from its national executive meeting in Dar es Salaam. Mbeki busied himself with issues such as the protest against increases in student fees for foreign students, nuclear disarmament, and solidarity struggles with the peoples of Zimbabwe, Spain, Cyprus, Iraq, Iran and Vietnam, and the Portuguese-controlled territories. The YSS took an active role in the anti-Vietnam War movement, a campaign spearheaded by Mbeki. This led to Mbeki's friend, Essop Pahud, being elected onto the organizing committee of the Vietnam Solidarity Campaign, VSC. The YSS became a major player in the anti-war marches. On March 17, 1968, Mbeki took part in a massive anti-Vietnam demonstration outside the American Embassy in London's Grosvenor Square and had his upper right molar tooth cracked when he was attacked by a policeman. Although he was arraigned and arrested for his part in the demonstration, he was not one of the 246 that were eventually charged. Mbeki completed his master's degree at Sussex University in May 1968. Mbeki was finally given permission to undergo a year of military training at the Lenin International School in Moscow. He arrived in Moscow in February 1969 and became a student at the Lenin Institute, which was established exclusively for communists, the exception being non-communist members of liberation movements who could get ideological training at the institute. Mbeki excelled at the institute and regularly addressed the institute's weekly assembly. While in Moscow, he continued writing articles, documents, and speeches for the ANC and its organs. In June 1969, Mbeki was chosen to be secretary of a high-level SACP delegation to the International Conference of Communist and Workers' Parties in Moscow. In June 1970, Mbeki was secretly shuttled from his military camp northwest of Moscow to the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, CPSU, guest house in Volenskoy, where the South African Communist Party's, SACP's, Central Committee was holding its meeting. This was indeed significant because, up to this point, the SACP leadership had been largely non-African. Mbeki and several Africans were now included in the committee, including Chris Hani. Both Hani and Mbeki celebrated their 28th birthdays at this meeting, making them the youngest members to ever serve on the committee. While in Moscow, Mbeki was trained in advanced guerrilla warfare at Skodina, and although he was more comfortable with a book rather than a gun, the training was considered a necessary requirement if he was to be accepted as a leader. His military training was cut short as he was sent back to London to prepare for a new post in Lusaka. Throughout Mbeki's training, he kept in constant contact with Zanili. Together with Oliver Tambo, Mbeki left London for Lusaka in April 1971 to take up the position of Assistant Secretary of the ANC's Revolutionary Council, RC. This was the first time in 9 years that Mbeki was setting foot on African soil. The aim of the RC at this time was to bridge an ever-widening gap between the ANC in exile and the people back home. In Lusaka, Mbeki was housed in a secret location in Makeni, southwest of the city. Later, Mbeki moved over to work in the ANC's propaganda section. But he continued to attend RC meetings. 4 months after his arrival in Lusaka, Mbeki traveled to Biklangen to deliver a speech on behalf of the ANC's executive committee at the YSS Summer School. This was a turning point in Mbeki's life, as it was the first time he spoke on behalf of the ANC as opposed to the ANC Youth League. Why should we, in the Freedom Charter, say South Africa belongs to all who live in it, black and white, when our country is under foreign invaders, who even call themselves Europeans? Why therefore should we not say that South Africa belongs to the black people? Why should we not say, power to the black people? Comrades, we hope you will have something to say on these questions. A dream deferred. One has to wonder whether these words were the beginnings of the making of an Africanist or just an attempt to stir up the anti-apartheid movement. In December 1972, Mbeki joined Tambo at Heathrow Airport to meet Mangosuthu Buthelezi to discuss mass resistance to apartheid. Mbeki is credited with facilitating the establishment of Inkatha. It was his responsibility to nurture the relationship between Buthelezi and the ANC. Mbeki was deployed to Botswana in 1973 to facilitate the development of an internal underground. Mbeki's life took a significant turn on November 23, 1974, when he married Zanili Dlamini. The wedding ceremony took place at Farnham Castle, the residence of Zanili's sister Edith and her husband, Wilfred Grenville Gray. Adelaide Tambo and Mendi Misimang stood in loco parentis for Mbeki, while Esop Pahad was Mbeki's best man. The wedding, according to ANC rules, had to be approved by the organization, a rule that applied to all permanently deployed members of the ANC. In January 1975, just a few months after his marriage to Zanili, Mbeki was sent to Swaziland to assess the possibility of setting up an ANC frontline base in the country. Ostensibly attending a UN conference, Mbeki was accompanied by Max Sisulu. The duo met with Sisulu's sister, Lindiwe Sisulu, who was studying at the university at Swaziland. Lindiwe set up a meeting for the two at the home of Esbuletin Andeb, then a librarian at the university. Mbeki and Sisulu held meetings in Swaziland for a week with South Africans studying there to assess the situation. They returned to Lusaka after a week, when their visas had expired. Mbeki reported back to the ANC that the possibility of establishing an ANC base in Swaziland was promising, especially because of its location, as it was close to Johannesburg and Durban. As a result, Mbeki was sent back to Swaziland to recruit soldiers for the organization's military wing. In Swaziland, Mbeki recruited hundreds of people into the ANC. He also liaised with Buthelezi and the latter's newly formed Inkatha movement, and set up structures within South Africa. Mbeki's aim was to establish contact with as many Black Consciousness Movement, BCM, members as he could, and to draw them into the ANC. Ironically, while Mbeki was converting BC adherents into ANC members, he would himself absorb many aspects of BC ideology. In March 1976, Mbeki, Albert Dlomo and Jacob Zuma were arrested in Swaziland, but the trio managed to escape deportation to South Africa. Instead, a month after their arrest, they were escorted across the border to Mozambique. From there, Mbeki went back to Lusaka for a few months before being posted to Nigeria in January 1977. Before leaving Lusaka, Mbeki was appointed as deputy to Duma Nakwi in the Department of Information and Propaganda, DIP. Mbeki's mission in Nigeria was to establish diplomatic relations with Olusegun Obasanjo's regime, a mission that proved to be quite successful as Mbeki was to build a lasting relationship with the Nigerian authorities, eclipsing the Pan-Africanist Congress, PAC, in Nigeria. Zanili, who was running the Africa offices of the International University Education Fund in Lusaka, spent much of 1977 with her husband in Nigeria. In 1978, Mbeki became political secretary in the office of Oliver Tambo. He became a close confidant of Tambo, advising him on all matters and writing many of his speeches. One of his duties as secretary was to choose a theme each year in accordance with the ANC's current activities. 1979, for example, was known as the Year of the Spear, while 1980 was the Year of the Charter. From 1979, with Mbeki as his right-hand man, Tambo began building up the guerrilla movement into an internationally recognized guardian of South African freedom. Mbeki was sent to Salisbury immediately after Robert Mugabe took office in 1980. On August 11, 1980, Tambo and Mbeki met with Mugabe and his advisor, Emmerson Mnangagwa, in Salisbury. The meeting resulted in MK being allowed to move ammunition and cotters through Zimbabwe. Mugabe guaranteed that his government would assist ANC cooperatives in Zimbabwe. Mbeki, preferring to return to Lusaka, decided to hand over the reins in Zimbabwe to Chris Hani, who was to continue the relationship with Mugabe. In July 1981, Jokabi, the ANC representative in Zimbabwe, was assassinated at his home. The relationship between the ANC and the Zimbabwean government came under strain. During the 1980s, Mbeki became a leading figure in the SACP, rising to the party's central committee by the mid-1980s. The SACP was a vital part of the ANC alliance. In February 1982, Mbeki's brother Jama disappeared. He was later presumed dead. In 1985, P.W. Botha declared a state of emergency and gave the army and police special powers. In 1986, the South African Army sent a captain in the South African Defence Force, SADF, to kill Mbeki. The plan was to put a bomb in his house in Lusaka, but the assassin was arrested by the Zambian police before he could go through with the plan. In 1985, Mbeki became the ANC's director of the Department of Information and Publicity and coordinated diplomatic campaigns to involve more white South Africans in anti-apartheid activities. In 1989, he rose in the ranks to head the ANC's Department of International Affairs and was involved in the ANC's negotiations with the South African government. Mbeki played a major role in turning the international media against apartheid. Raising the diplomatic profile of the ANC, Mbeki acted as a point of contact for foreign governments and international organizations, and he was extremely successful in this position. Mbeki also played the role of ambassador to the steady flow of delegates from the elite sectors of white South Africa. These included academics, clerics, business people, and representatives of liberal white groups who traveled to Lusaka to assess the ANC's views on a democratic, free South Africa. Mbeki was seen as pragmatic, eloquent, rational, and urbane. He was known for his diplomatic style and sophistication, which went against the view, held by many right-wing organizations, that the ANC was a terrorist organization. In the early 80s, Mbeki, Jacob Zuma and Aziz Pahad were appointed by Tambo to conduct private talks with representatives of the National Party government. 12 meetings between the parties took place between November 1987 and May 1990, most of them held at a country house near Bath in Somerset, England. By September 1989, the team secretly met with Merit Sparwater and Mike Lew in a hotel in Switzerland. Known as Operation Flare, P.W. Botha was kept informed of all the meetings. At the same time, Mandela and Kabi Kutsi, then Minister of Justice, were also holding secret talks. In 1989, Botha suffered a stroke and was replaced by F.W. de Klerk, who announced on February 2, 1990 that the ANC, SACP, PAC, and other liberation movements were to be unbanned. This was a dramatic step, even for the National Party, but it was the pragmatic and moderate attitude of Mandela and Mbeki that played a crucial role in paving the way forward. Both of them reassured the National Party that the mass black constituency would accept the idea of negotiations. A new constitutional order was in the offing. As a sign of goodwill, de Klerk set free a few of the ANC's top leadership at the end of 1989, among them Govan Mbeki. Between 1990 and 1994, the ANC began preparing for the first democratic elections. It was an adjustment period, and Mbeki played a crucial role in transforming the ANC into a legal political organization. In 1991, the ANC was able to hold its first legal conference in the country after 30 years of being banned. The party now had the task of finding a middle ground for discussion between all the various factions, the returning exiles, the long-term prisoners, and those who had stayed behind to lead the struggle. Mbeki was chosen as national chair while Cyril Ramaphosa was elected Secretary General and the ANC's chief negotiator at the multi-party talks. Mbeki had up to this point been handling much of the diplomatic talks with the apartheid regime, and given his diplomatic experience and the level of bargaining that was expected, it came as a surprise that Mbeki was sidelined in favor of Ramaphosa. Mbeki was now in a contest to become Mandela's deputy. His rivals were Ramaphosa and Chris Hani, Secretary General of the SACP. However, Mbeki had a strong support base among the ANC Youth League and the ANC's Women's League. When Chris Hani was assassinated in 1993, Mbeki and Ramaphosa were left to contest the position of deputy president. After South Africa's first democratic election in April 1994, Mandela chose Mbeki to be the first deputy president in the government of national unity. On May 10, 1994, Mbeki was sworn into his new post with F.W. de Klerk as the second deputy president. The ANC's alliance partners, the SACP and Congress of South African Trade Unions COSATU, appeared to approve of Mbeki in this position, and Ramaphosa quit politics to go into business. The National Party withdrew from the Government of National Unity in June 1996, and Mbeki then became the sole deputy president. Although Mbeki was officially deputy president, he was referred to as the de facto prime minister, as Mandela left the duties of state to Mbeki while he presided over a process of national reconciliation and busied himself with international relations. While in this position, Mbeki formed a consultative council made up of black politicians, academics, and professionals. The council included the likes of Paulus Zulu, the then chair of the South African Broadcasting Corporation, SABC, Mheza Mashalawa, Sidney Mufamadi, and Brigalia Bam, who became the chair of the Independent Electoral Commission, IEC. The council, nicknamed the Kitchen Cabinet by the media, met once a month with Esop Pahad as the convener. In his attempt to encourage black economic aspirations, Mbeki appointed mainly black staff members. In order to maintain a support base for the ANC, Mbeki targeted the townships and rural poor. He was particularly considerate to the rural chiefs, introducing a rural development strategy, while plans for urban renewal focused on the townships. Mbeki chose to build bridges between former enemies, one such example being his conciliatory attitude towards the Inkatha Freedom Party, IFP. Jacob Zuma, who was then the chair of the ANC in KwaZulu-Natal, assisted Mbeki in this project. However, Mbeki was cool towards the SACP and kept a distance from the COSATU leadership. COSATU's rejection of the growth, employment, and redistribution strategy, GEAR, policy, introduced to Parliament in June 1996, was probably the reason for the rift between Mbeki and the union leaders. Mbeki played a key role in introducing and defending GEAR policy. As soon as Mbeki became deputy president, the media became intensely suspicious of him. In the early years when the ANC was newly unbanned and even during the negotiations, he was seen as a charming pragmatist. This changed quickly as he was now portrayed as a power-hungry manipulator who had the ability to sideline internal opponents and challengers to his leadership. Mbeki's insistence on having a regular government slot on public radio and television alienated the media, which did not take well to what was seen as state interference. At the 50th conference of the ANC at Mafeking in 1997, Mbeki was elected the new president of the African National Congress. In August 1998, he launched his African Renaissance banquet at Gallagher Estate in Midrand. Mbeki initially articulated the concept of the African Renaissance soon after his return from exile, when he felt there was a need to promote a restoration of the African identity and a sense of self-worth and dignity. He promulgated the concept at a continental level, and laid the foundation for the transformation of the Organization of African Unity into the African Union, and for New Partnership for Africa's Development, NIPAD, a strategy to renew the continent. Many of Mbeki's policies were influenced by his concept of African identity. Described by some as a quintessential African nationalist, Mbeki was driven by a desire to free South Africa and Africa as a whole from racial oppression and colonialism. His principal aim, according to The Economist, has been to establish the new South Africa as, first and foremost, a black African country. In Mbeki's own words, he wanted to persuade Africa to set up its own institutions and mechanisms for solving its problems, thus ending the constant, humiliating requests for aid to the West's former colonial powers. Mbeki was most noted for his efforts in setting up permanent institutions to serve Africa, such as the New Partnership for Africa's Development, NIPAD, and the African Union, O. Launched in 2001 with its headquarters in South Africa, NIPAD was designed to heed a call to Africans to find African solutions to their problems. Launched in 2001, NIPAD, very much Mbeki's idea, is a socio-economic development blueprint for the continent which, crucially, is designed to make African countries themselves responsible for upholding standards of democracy and good governance through the African peer review mechanism. Mbeki was heavily criticized for his perceived complacency with regard to the rule of Zimbabwe's president, Robert Mugabe. Critics believed that instead of quiet diplomacy, Mbeki should have taken a tougher line against Mugabe, who dealt violently with opposition to his regime and expropriated farms owned by whites. The crises of the Zimbabwean economy had a knock-on effect in South Africa as thousands of Zimbabweans flooded into the country, seeking employment and refuge. The influx has, according to some, led to an increase in crime and a housing shortage. The situation resulted in a series of xenophobic attacks in May 2008. Mbeki was accused of failing to acknowledge the magnitude of the problem. Mbeki's downfall can be traced to the moment in 2005 when he relieved Jacob Zuma of his duties as deputy president due to his implication in the corruption scandal. This caused a split in the ANC between Mbeki's allies and supporters of Zuma. At the ANC conference in Polokwane in December 2007, Mbeki once again stood for election as ANC president but lost to Jacob Zuma, who went on to become the ANC's presidential candidate for the 2009 general election. In 2008, Jacob Zuma was cleared of all corruption charges, leading to the ANC National Executive Committee's decision to recall Mbeki. This resulted in Mbeki announcing his resignation on September 21, 2008. After leaving office, Mbeki was appointed as the African Union's lead negotiator for resolving the conflict between Sudan and South Sudan. Thank you for watching this video.